Hello and welcome back to the Americano Show. I'm delighted to be joined today by Michael Shellenberger, who is CBR Chair of Politics, Censorship and Free Speech at the University of Austin in Texas, and a brilliant Substacker. I highly recommend everybody reads Public News to get the latest from Michael. Michael, I want to start by talking about a very strange advertisement that was played at halftime in the Super Bowl, probably the most watched event on TV in the American calendar. And I think we can play it here now. It was for Ring, which is a company owned by Amazon that do door cameras, security door cameras. Let's watch it now.
This is Milo. Pets are family. But every year, 10 million go missing. And the way we look for them hasn't changed in years. Until now. One post of a dog's photo in the Ring app starts outdoor cameras looking for a match. Search Party from Ring uses AI to help families find lost dogs. Since launch, more than a dog a day has been reunited with their family. Be a hero in your neighborhood with Search Party. Available to everyone for free right now. Join the neighborhood at ring.com.
So, Michael, that rather cutesy advertisement for helping find lost dogs freaked quite a lot of people out, and I think rightly, didn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And hey, Freddie, good to see you again. Yeah, I don't think anybody saw this coming. There was no hint that this was happening. We've sort of learned gradually about all the ways that our privacy is being violated in the United States. I will say that I think that the United States is different than Europe in the sense that I think that we're much more concerned around free speech and much less concerned about privacy than folks in Europe. And I get the sense that I think Europeans are much more concerned about privacy than about free speech. And I think you see that in the laws and in the historical development differences between our countries. But nonetheless, I think the Ring ad went too far for many Americans. You have this suspicion that these things are going on, including that your iPhone is recording you and that your cameras are secretly recording. But for them to just come out and say this and then to sort of frame it cleverly around losing a dog, I think did alarm people. And I did see that there was a fair amount of media coverage and certainly a lot of social media posts kind of raising the alarm about this, raising a set of questions that I don't really think are answered, like from a legal point of view, whether this was ever legal and what the what they're thinking in terms of having gathered this. Now, my understanding is that there was a consent to this, that people that own Ring cameras, and I'm a Ring camera owner, that we, somehow agreed to. But I mean, it's a joke, right? I mean, it's the jokes about like seeing all the regulations you're supposed to pour through when you sign up for a new piece of technology. Nobody reads those. Nobody reads the updates. So, yeah, I mean, I think the other thing I would say, I think the fact that there wasn't even a greater response is just because there's so much going on in the United States and in the world, including around concerns that people that are more concerned with civil liberties are focused on. I think people here are just continually obsessed with the Epstein files. It feels like there's no bottom to them. Like we just keep discovering new things. We've had a piece that just came out that took us a few days to really figure it out. And then I think, I'm about to publish, but obviously there's a lot of stuff going on with censorship. So I think that those of us that should have been responding more quickly to this were a bit taken off guard. And then this amazing coincidence that Nancy Guthrie's apparent abductor, or her mother's apparent abductor, was captured on film. Was amazingly good timing, I would say, for the companies that are engaged in this kind of surveillance. I'm not sure if that was Ring or Nest, but
Yeah.
nonetheless, I consider it extremely alarming. I see behaviors from our governments that are just constantly crossing lines that are extremely transgressive in terms of traditional constitutional rights, including privacy. So I find it an extremely alarming development and very glad that you're drawing attention to it.
Well, I think I think it was Nest with Nancy Guffrey, the footage of the burglar or possibly her abductor in a balaclava outside the door. I think what was amazing about that is that had been talked about before, that she did have a Google Nest system, but it wasn't backing up to the cloud, so the files were lost. And then suddenly the FBI, Kash Patel, on his social media handle, posts the frames, clips of the footage with the image of this guy. So this was something that clearly is still being recorded, even though it wasn't meant to be. And I think that's what's so frightening about, you mentioned people's phones listening to them and so on. We feel like the people who use these devices, feel like kind of boiled frogs. We're so distracted with everything else that we're not noticing the fact that the surveillance of our lives through tech is growing and growing and growing, and it's a major privacy concern.
Yeah, I mean, if one were a conspiracy theorist, one might imagine that the entire Nancy Guthrie thing were orchestrated in order to support this point, because what could be a better advertisement for allowing uh, your rings or your Nest cameras to be recording activity than to capture this abduction and to potentially capture the abductor? I mean, it couldn't have been, the timing couldn't have been better for it. But yeah, I think that that's a really apt metaphor for it. I think that, look, safety constantly trumps concerns over privacy. It certainly did after 9/11 in the United States. And I think in most Western countries, people are willing to give away their freedom for safety. And to some extent, so would I. I think so would other people. And it's worth just being honest about the extent to which we are willing to sacrifice our privacy for security. And then I think also for convenience. I travel a ton. I'm a huge civil liberties advocate. I use Clear, when I walk through the airports, which is a kind of a premium paid service to move through airports more quickly. I love it, and I'm not going to lie. I mean, but you are absolutely being scanned the entire time. The same thing for TSA a lot of pre-scanning, and then, now you travel through Europe, and it's just incredible how quickly you can get through security. So you're caught a little bit as somebody that, on the one hand, we hate bureaucracy and we hate, the, government, just how inefficient it is and how nobody cares and how they don't apply technological solutions fast enough. Well, here you get to, airports, and they're marvels now of processing people in ways that I think many of us feared wouldn't be possible after 9/11. The home video cameras, I mean, the doorbell cameras, is really next level. I don't know that anybody's really thought about what the implications of it are. I'm gonna write a story on it myself. I'll contact the main civil liberties groups. Will there be lawsuits? Will it be stopped? The way that they rolled it out, and even with the amount of concern about it, it almost seems muted as a reaction. So it does make me feel like it is here to stay. And yeah, it starts to, like, some of the most conspiratorial, paranoid thinking about the digital state and totalitarianism starts to feel like it's coming true, including the part where we all just kind of accept it and go along with it. And I think that is something to be concerned about. We don't have a robust civil liberties organization in the United States that fights on these things anymore. It used to be the ACLU, but ACLU has essentially gone along with a lot of certainly the cancel culture. It called for a censorship of a major book on the transgender issue. We have organizations like FIRE, which does some great work in terms of free speech in universities. But really, our own civil liberties capacity in the United States has been debilitated, I think in part because of the influence of the George Soros's foundation, because of kind of what we would call wokeness, or a kind of hyper concern around policing language. So I think there's just a general atrophying of our civil liberties culture and institutions in the United States that, gives me a lot of concern.
And you're quite right to point that out, that safety often trumps privacy, but also convenience increasingly trumps privacy. And facial recognition I mean, these door companies have got in trouble over using facial recognition in the past. As you say, when you go on a flight these days in America, your face will be recognized. And I believe some of these new glasses technologies are developing or rolling out facial recognition technology, so that if you don't remember someone you're talking to, your glasses will tell you who they are through face recognition, which is an extraordinary invasion of the other person's privacy. But it seems to be, because it's so cool and buzzy and amazing, everybody seems to just be, saying, oh, that's a bit creepy, but let's go along with it.
Well, that's right. And I don't know what the rules are in Europe or in the UK, but in the United States that when you're in public spaces, people can photograph you. I mean, I guess that's probably the same in Europe. I mean, that's why paparazzi can get away with what they're doing. There's a famous video of somebody that is filming Tucker Carlson when he's fishing.
I didn't know you could fish here.
You can.
You can?
Yeah.
What are you fishing for?
Are you videotaping me?
Yeah,
Why?
because you're in public. I can.
Well, I know you can.
Okay.
I'm not challenging your right. I just
Okay.
want to know why you
I
want.
find it interesting that you're fishing in Central Park.
Oh, yeah, it's absolutely allowed.
And what do you use for bait?
I fly fish, so I use flies. I'll show you.
Oh, those are the things you make.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, the string. I'm stupid. I don't fly fish.
What do you do with the video?
I put it up on my channel. I have a lot of people that follow me.
Do you really?
Yeah.
That's great.
I have about 15,000 people that follow me.
Really?
Yeah.
That's so neat.
And Tucker handles it very well, because they, surprise him and then they say to him right away, well, this is legal. And he said, yeah, I know it's legal. I mean, it's obviously he's trying to fish by himself and enjoy some privacy, but that is legal. And I think for, good reasons. I think that the other thing that is so interesting is that, we have gotten real benefits from putting putting cameras on police officers, what are known as body cameras or body cams. Those were initially resisted by, I think they were resisted actually by police unions. I think they were resisted to some extent by other privacy advocates. They've turned out to be a marvel in terms of debunking a lot of the outlandish claims that have been made, particularly by the radical left in the United States, by Black Lives Matter, by people exaggerating police brutality. The body cams, they certainly catch police officers when they abuse their powers, but they also, capture police when they're, following the right protocols and they're helping to debunk some of the more sensational claims that are being made. But I think, one flashpoint on this issue, and I discovered this inadvertently. You may remember that when Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, came out with his proposal for digital identifications, many of us were caught off guard. I had heard some noise about it and actually had spoken to some of my British friends and colleagues that were concerned about this, but it was really not something people had mobilized for. We discovered quite quickly that a lot of the demand for it had originated through the Tony Blair Institute, and that the Tony Blair Institute had received significant funding from Larry Ellison, the founder and owner of Oracle, the major database company, and credit, by the way, to the New Statesman, which did some impressive reporting connecting these dots. I went online and found Larry Ellison giving a talk. I believe it was at his Oracle annual meeting, where he said, we're going to have basically cameras everywhere. We'll have cameras on police officers. Police officers will be on their best behavior. And then he said citizens will be on their best behavior. And he says that he's so excited. He's so happy to let the audience know that we will have cameras on everybody and they'll be on their best behavior. I mean, this is just right out of a kind of, nightmare scenario for privacy advocates. A lot of people, like, particularly on the left, that grew up reading Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault would talk about how Jeremy Bentham's prison scheme he used it as a metaphor for sort of, constantly monitoring ourselves and monitoring the behaviors and thoughts of others. I mean, here's Larry Ellison just openly talking about that as, a benefit to society. I posted that little clip of Larry Ellison saying that about, just cameras. And he was also talking about digital IDs. But I mean, it went, wildly viral. I think it has something like over 40,000 shares on X and millions of people saw it. It wasn't something that Elon Musk, by the way, retweeted. Often when you get those really big, retweets, it's something that the owner of the platform has shared, but he did not share it. Elon is famously close with Larry Ellison. Larry Ellison, the more you learn about it, the more troubling it becomes, because Oracle itself begins as a CIA contracting project. In fact, Oracle, the name, was the name of a CIA project. And so really Oracle was built with US government money, with CIA money. And I'm not even saying that that's necessarily a bad thing, because I do think that the military industrial complex in the United States, which is something I've been critical of, particularly for creating and feeding the censorship industrial complex. I think that it's also, at the heart of the surveillance industrial complex. It's delivered a lot of really wonderful technologies. I mean, really all the major technologies, satellites, microchips, internet, these things all came out of the US Defense Department and its R&D operation at DARPA, plus the long-term contracting. So, Like all these technologies, it's two-sided. It's a blessing and a curse. And I think we're entering a really, in some ways, it is a really terrifying new era. Somebody on X a couple of days ago posted something to the extent of saying, we went from don't share any of your private information with anybody on the internet to everybody will have to give all your private information to the government to access the internet in about 10 years. And I think that we have been boiling along in this water on all these fronts on a sort of total digital surveillance, which was some of the language that was used after 9/11 in terms of the security proposals by the George W. Bush administration. It now appears that they're coming to fruition. So it's something to the equivalent of total surveillance, almost everywhere all the time, whether you're, on somebody's private property, visiting their home, or just walking along the streets, in the airports and public places. It starts to seem like that has become, complete, and that now the government is going to, these governments are all, and we just saw the last 2 weeks, in fact, it was last week, I believe, when the United States House of Representatives came out with a big report on censorship. Basically, the exact same time, we saw the French and Spanish and other governments announcing that they would require digital IDs and the end of anonymity online. So it's hard, you know, um, another win for the conspiracy theorists, and that it really does appear that governments are sort of working together to time and potentially, who knows, Amazon, also a major U.S. government contractor, timing these announcements all at the same time, so that suddenly we find ourselves in a situation that I have great concerns that we'll ever be able to get back out of.
Well, William Hague, the former British Foreign Secretary, now the Vice Chancellor of Oxford, said on social media recently that social media is no longer compatible with democracy, which was an interesting comment made at an interesting time. And just to go back quickly on the face recognition stuff, as I understand it, you'll probably know more about this than I do. In fact, I'm sure you will. But the technology to do that was sort of first developed using data from private companies who had maybe breached the law in scraping masses of information from social media accounts originally. So the security state effectively was buying up data that was already dodgily assembled. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, that sounds exactly right. That's my understanding as well. And it's been much more sophisticated than people have known for a long time. 2 years ago, I was at a party in Berkeley, and a young man in his 20s had a startup, and he was showing us the facial recognition software he had on his phone. It was a company and a technology he had developed, and was able to just show us, taking a photo of people in the room as a party trick, showing us how much information they were. I mean, they were scraping it from everywhere, and he was able to show people in photographs that were taken that people had never seen before. And so you realize that that's already kind of a consumer product. You realize that the government and organizations like Palantir and others have had this technology for a really long time. And yeah, almost certainly, the entire AI industry is resting on top of illegally having harvested information and data from all sorts of sources, and appear to be getting away with it, or they've all decided that they're just going to end up settling, in some court lawsuit. But for example, I know my books are in the AI because sometimes when I'm doing research on topics that are related to my books, it'll cite me in my books. So I know that my books have been scraped, and I never, there was no compensation for them. And imagine the same thing for images. So I do think that one, silver lining to that reality is that there should be some remedies. If you had a functioning if you had a functioning governmental system, then you might be able to, you might be able to kind of negotiate some sort of privacy protections on the basis of that, essentially theft of intellectual property and violations of privacy. Doesn't seem like we have a Congress or a government that's particularly interested in protecting those rights.
And this is happening at a time when AI seems to be developing in ways that are frightening some of the biggest experts in AI. And so you potentially have a situation where, I don't want to sound hysterical, but where the state is enabling systems that will then enable an AI to have incredible control over the privacy and information of private citizens.
Yeah, that's right. I will say I am deeply alarmed by it on the one hand. On the other hand, as we look at the censorship that's been occurring and was actually much worse than we had thought, and only we learn about how bad it was now. In fact, just literally the last 2 weeks, we all keep thinking that we finally got to the bottom of the censorship industrial complex, and then some new, information will come out, and we realize we hadn't seen the entire picture. I think the thing for me is just that on all the major censorship decisions, they're human decisions made by executives of social media companies. They're using AI as a tool to implement those decisions, but those are human decisions being made by people to censor, on all the big issues that everybody remembers: COVID origins, COVID vaccines, the Hunter Biden laptop. They were censoring on the 2020 election, censoring on climate change, trying to censor criticisms of renewable energy, trying to censor and are censoring people that are referring to people by their biological sex rather than their preferred pronouns. So those are all decisions being made by highly political people in powerful situations. The problem is that it is a workaround for the First Amendment because and this is something that the architects of the censorship industrial complex realized very early on, is that private companies can censor speech however they want to censor them, and that is their right to do that under the First Amendment and under free speech protections in other countries. The problem is then that their monopolies. In fact, it's more concentrated than it was even under the older pre-internet media monopolies, because really there's just not that many platforms for news exchange. There's just X, formerly Twitter, there's Meta, there's TikTok. I was deplatformed from TikTok, and apparently had received warnings that I never even saw through the platform, but I was deplatformed for some combination of criticisms of the dominant ideology on climate change and on transgenderism. So if you're somebody that is trying to communicate and you're deplatformed from, all the major platforms, you're basically depersoned and denied a fundamental right to free speech, but done so in a completely constitutional way, where the Supreme Court could just say, well, start your own social media platform, which is just a joke when you understand that the network effects, the monopoly power of the social media companies, it's not something like in them or in the technology, it's in the billions of people that have invested a huge amount of time and energy into creating a network. So you actually end up in a situation that I think that lends itself to much more censorship and control than anything that we had before. I mean, like the famous in the 16th and 17th centuries, the governments would be chasing printing presses around Europe, and they would smuggle them into Netherlands, and then they would have them in they would hide these printing presses, and they'd print the pamphlets, and they'd sneak them around. It's a lot easier actually to evade state restrictions on printing materials than it is on the internet. If you properly are able to control all the major social media platforms, then you've controlled the entire information environment. And that is quite clearly what governments are after. They want to have complete control over all the information because they want to control, thought and behavior. And, even as recently as a year or two ago, I felt reluctant to saying things like that because it sounds so paranoid, but that is the factual reality, is that we have actors now in these governments that are looking to engage in thought control and behavior control to control elections, to control a broader set of behaviors. There's a major new book coming out on the censorship industrial complex from Jacob Siegel, and he describes this as essentially a whole new form of governance. And it's sort of one that you would have glimpses of in even as early as in the 90s and the early 2000s, but we now see that it is essentially all in place. And and I think at a moment where there's less and less that one can do about it. I mean, I think that we're in an extremely dangerous, perilous moment, in the sense that I think it could kind of go either way, and that's why it makes sense that these things would be all occurring at such a clearly a moment of compressed history where there's just so much going on, and that we might see, three major governments in Europe fall over the next 3 years. We have huge uncertainty around the future of the United States. It's understandable that the technological revolution that we've been going through over the last 25 years preceded and essentially enabled or intensified a whole set of other transformations to the global system.
And I mean, a lot of supporters of free speech, people who believe in liberty, were relieved by the arrival of Trump in many ways. And I think some people in Europe who believe in free speech and so on have been pleased that the State Department and Vice President J.D. Vance have been pressuring Britain in particular to stop its obvious censorship and suppression of free speech online. However, as you suggest, with this sort of potential work around the First Amendment, it might just take a change of government, which will surely happen at some point, for things to go back and to go back much harder in the direction of suppression on the American side.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different possibilities. I think the Trump administration has done really important work in advocating for free speech around the world. It's the J.D. Vance speech, I think, in Munich was really important. I think that the Trump administration did things on Brazil. It's pushing, it denied visas to censors in Europe. There's also been some mistakes, in my view, where the administration has not been perfect on free speech, and I think that's undermined the positive things they've done. I think we saw with Brazil, for example, that the need to keep inflation down, because Brazil's such a major, the United States imports so much Brazilian food, beef and coffee and orange juice, and that when you put, the president put significant tariffs on Brazil in response to its undermining of democracy there and censorship, and then he ended up lifting them in a way that I worry kind of undermined the power of those actions. I think similarly, there's just always so much on the table with Europe where I think that nobody knows. I think that there's a way in which I think that Trump is and the Europeans are playing kind of a waiting game. I think the Europeans are hoping, the European governments, and I would say just Germany, France, and Britain, it seems like those heads of state are just hoping that the Democrats take back one of the houses of Congress later this year, and then that a Democrat is elected in 2028 so that they can all get back to this vision of essentially a completely, a total global regulation of the internet. I think the Trump administration is hoping that, the French government, that you get a new French government next year, a new German government the year after, and then a change in Britain. Although it seems like even in Britain, the government almost, my understanding is the government almost fell in response to the Epstein files having to do with Lord Mandelson, who had to step down from the House of Lords, had to resign from the Starmer cabinet, and that was an opportunity for some opponents within the Labor coalition to try to threaten Starmer. So you see it's an incredible moment. I was sort of like, it's like when you were reading about the 19th century, and like the French Commune and the famous essays by Karl Marx about what was going on in France, and there's sort of a sense in which history is really, the entire global system is changing in some very very rapidly. And it struck me that is the moment that we're in, very similar to the sort of to that period of the mid 19th century, or maybe the early 20th, or the early to mid 20th century, where there's some technological transformations that have occurred, but also which also results in a change of consciousness and a change of these global systems and forms of government, and that's we're in for just a continuing wild ride over the next several years as it all ends up shaking out.
Well, let's end by talking a little bit about the Epstein files. Obviously, there's been a hell of a lot of talk about it in the last few weeks. But it is interesting that, as you say, it's arrived at this moment when everything seems to be in flux. And the way in which it's arrived is particularly interesting. I think that we haven't had all the files yet. We may never have all the files. We don't know. But there was this huge dump a few days ago of millions of files. And it's now journalists are in the same position as the public, as in they're just searching through these files. There are so many different theories whirling around, and it's almost as though everybody is constructing their own Epstein reality, and it's almost a game for people to sort of, what's your theory? And then you find emails to justify your own theory. Something very, very strange is happening there, and I wonder what your thoughts are about it.
Yeah, I think that so first of all, it's an extraordinary victory for the people, for democracy. It's a testament to the power of the internet. These files were demanded by the people, particularly by the Trump MAGA coalition. These files were being, suppressed. The entire issue, Epstein, there was a cover-up going on by Democrats and Republicans for a very long time. I think that's very clear now. There was a hardcore group of people who, some of whom engage in some pretty wild and unsupported claims around just the craziest things that you've heard about Epstein. And I think that while I think those were wrong, I have to hand it to the conspiracy theorists because they effectively got these files. They forced the government to release them, and you had four Republicans. Thomas Massie, Nancy Mace, Lauren Boebert, and Marjorie Taylor Greene that basically sacrificed a significant part of their own political careers to switch sides and to vote with the Democrats, and ultimately for almost everybody, I think, in the House, except for one person, to vote for these files. So the files are very significant. There are more files to come. There's too many redactions. All those caveats aside, this is an extraordinary look into how the world is run and how our elites run the world. And to some extent, there's more banality to it. My basic picture of it is that there is a bit of a glimpse into a previous world. I think that he was just an amazing character in the sense of he was at the intersection of finance, criminal activity, and intelligence. And that I think that his downfall was that he just kept. I think that I think there was a kind of using of young women as potentially a way to get blackmail leverage, also just as a way to attract people to come and hang out with him. Epstein was just a master of thinking two steps ahead when I think most people, including some of our most successful people, are just really good at thinking one step ahead. He was an incredible master manipulator. He was getting inside information. Obviously, I think that's what the Mandelson case, showed, but other cases, he's getting inside information to be able to make financial deals. He's also charging a lot of money, and particularly we know now to the Rothschild, charging $20 million to help the Rothschilds to settle a case with the Department of Justice. So he had, just incredible contacts. I mean, it's sort of, I think people sometimes will say things like he was like an asset of the intelligence community. I think that understates his power. I mean, he had William Burns, who at the time was in the State Department, eventually became the director of the CIA under Biden, coming to Epstein's house. I think that there was more of a mutuality or reciprocity in the relationship between Epstein and the intelligence community. And I genuinely mean that I don't, and I think that he wasn't. I mean, at one point we see in the files that Epstein asks for his own files from the CIA. He has his attorneys ask the CIA for his files, which is kind of interesting. And the CIA says, "Oh, we can't find anything," but they write it in such a way to suggest that they didn't do a complete look through all the files. There's still a lot more to go, but it does seem like the basic picture here is just and a reminder that the intelligence community is working with some extremely nefarious people. It always has. Clandestine operations always require somebody to be to basically do the finances. The intelligence community is often working with the criminal underworld, especially if it needs to do things that are illegal, and it allows for a lot of plausible deniability. But for me, I think and I think it's also just the beginning. I mean, we've called now for a 9/11 type investigation, an independent blue ribbon commission, because the underlying problem, Freddie, I think is that, and one that doesn't get enough attention, is just that our intelligence community has not had significant reform for 50 years since the Church Committee hearings in the 1970s. There was serious reforms that were taken right after 9/11 when the Congress created the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. That position as director is now held by Tulsi Gabbard, but Tulsi Gabbard is supposed to have oversight and power over CIA, FBI, all these different intelligence communities, all these different intelligence organizations, but she clearly doesn't. She's been sidelined in the administration. The CIA essentially remains completely unreformed, despite the CIA's own role in essentially working to undermine the president. So if anybody had an interest in trying to clean up the CIA, you think it would be the president, but the CIA remains the dominant agency in the intelligence community, and we just don't have the constitution. I mean, we don't have the congressional oversight of the CIA that the Constitution requires. So for me, I hope that what we get out of it is some kind of significant reform, of the intelligence community, because we've seen them behind so much bad behavior, from, this kind of continually like mysterious relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, to the censorship industrial complex, to the total surveillance. There needs to be a continuing push to get our leaders to make our governments accountable to us. We are the ones that are supposed to control the intelligence communities, and not the other way around.
And they always have national security as their great trump card. I don't mean Trump in a punning on Donald Trump's name way. I mean Trump in its usual sense of national security is the great excuse that intelligence communities use on everything. And it's very hard to argue with at a kind of legal level.
Or at a political level, it's really hard to argue with. And I think that's why there are limits. I mean, I think when you start to see the intelligence community, or supposedly former people in the intelligence community, heavily involved in social media regulation or in censorship, I think most Americans kind of go, no, that crosses a line. Similarly, these, really serious invasions of privacy. But yeah, you start to get to things like airports. You start to get to things like, and I think the other issue is just that we now all have this memory of the forever wars. We have a memory of just how pointless the regime change operations and the occupations of Afghanistan have been. But, Iraq also, you look at places that we were sort of helped, at least with regime change, Libya, Egypt. These are not governments that appear to be, in many cases, it's worse. And so I think the American people are quite sick of those foreign engagements. And I do think that redounds to sort of, hey, we need to be in control of our intelligence community so it doesn't inadvertently get us into more forever wars.
Well, Michael Shellenberger, it's wonderful to talk to you, and fascinating insights as ever. Thank you very much for coming on. I'm glad we ended actually on Epstein, because of course he used cameras. Which was what we started with. So he was surveilling everyone he came into contact with, it seems. But thank you very much. We both say looking into cameras ourselves. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Freddie. A pleasure to speak with you.